Hi, I'm Jarrett Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. On this episode, I am joined by Lorne Buchman. Lorne is the president of ArtCenter College of Design in Pasadena, California, and the author of a new book called Make to Know: From Spaces of Uncertainty to Creative Discovery. He also hosts the really fascinating podcast Change Lab: Conversations on Transformation and Creativity. Originally trained in the theater, Lorne worked as a theater director, an educator, a scholar, and a college administrator. He wrote a book on the filmic adaptations of Shakespeare and served as president of both Saybrook University and California College of Arts. We begin this conversation, however, talking about his new book, Make to Know. We talk about how he reframes creative practice and how he thinks through these ideas in his own work at ArtCenter. We talk about how his time in the theater prepared him for running a college and the value of the connection between the studio room and the seminar room in uniting practice with theory. There's a lot in here that I think you'll really, really enjoy. If you like this show, I hope you consider supporting it on Patreon. We offer 3 monthly tiers, $3 for students, $5 for patrons, and $10 for superfans that give you access to all sorts of bonus content like a monthly newsletter, early episodes, full transcripts, and exclusive bonus interviews, all while helping to financially support this show. So if you like Scratching the Surface, if you want to see it continue, I hope you consider joining us on Patreon. You can visit patreon.com/surfacepodcast for all the details and to sign up. Thank you, as always, for listening, and here is my conversation with Lorne Buchman. I read your new book, Make to Know: From Spaces of Uncertainty to Creative Discovery, and I really enjoyed it. It's a really great meditation on creativity and perhaps maybe a rethinking of how we think about creativity or how we think about being creative people. And so I want to start there, and I think to frame this for listeners who are unfamiliar with the book, can you talk about this title, Make to Know, and kind of what this idea is and how you arrived at this idea of making to know?
Make to know really is the language I came up with to express that there is a way in which we come to know our work and that we come to know ourselves in a very important way through a making process, very broadly defined. Moving words on a page for a writer, engaging with the paint and canvas for a painter, the clay for a ceramicist, the space for an installation artist like Ann Hamilton, working with concepts of material time as Edgar Arsenault does, working with a mask as the great clown educator Jacques Lecoq did. I mean, these are all ways in which we engage in a making process. And I did want to debunk, partly for my students at Art Center, but also for a kind of general public, and maybe less for the professional artist and designer, though that was an interesting piece of it. The notion that the work of the artist and designer is somehow manifesting an already preconceived idea. The image I use repeatedly is Michelangelo seeing the angel in the stone and chipping away until he set it free.
Right.
When you talk to artists and designers, most of them don't work that way.
Right.
But they enter into a process. They enter actually into a place of uncertainty. And it's, the proverbial blank page, what that moment is about. And how they enter is also a very interesting idea that I try to explore in the book, as you know. Is it a question, an urge? Some call it a stomach ache. There are all different ways in which we go into a project, a brief for a designer, whatever it might be. But really, we enter places of uncertainty, and it's in the making itself that we come to know what the work is, what it emerges to be, how we can discover what it needs to be, and how we learn to kind of listen to it. Some say recognize it. That's Anne Hamilton's words. Others talk about how we are open to the surprises that the process brings.
I'm gonna ask you two questions. One's a more kind of personal question, and then a more kind of general question about the book. But I'm really interested in how this idea of making to know manifested itself in the making of this book. um, you have this term "make to know," and I found a TED talk that you had done almost 10 years ago now, 2012, talking about improv, and you use this term "make to know" in there, and I'm wondering how, in actually putting this book together, what new things did you find out, or how did making this introduce you to new concepts that you were not aware of when you started?
Fantastic question. Thank you. Because, of course, in the writing of this book, I was in a making process and discovered ideas and
Mhm.
thoughts and insights that I had really no idea about when I gave that TED talk. And I think if I shudder to look at that TED talk at this point now, but if I look at
It
that,
holds up. It's pretty
if I
good.
if I look at that TED talk and imagine what I was exploring then compared to really where the journey that the book uh, brought me to, I would say, unequivocally, it was the interviews and the writing and the countless shower moments that brought a discovery and an understanding and a knowing that was simply not present at the time I did the TED Talk. But of course, one could say the same thing about the TED Talk. Creating that, making that was also a way for me to start knowing something, forming something, and it's continued along. So that's one answer to your question. Another way to think about it is that I could, as far back as I can remember, and I discuss this a little in the book. I I needed to engage in the making. I needed to engage in the doing, and it was the big moment for me. Really was when I directed my first play in a directing class in college and had a teacher who just threw me in the deep end, said, "You want to learn how to direct? Okay, find something and start directing it." And it was a Chekhov comedic romp called The Boor. And honestly, I had no idea what I was doing. Absolutely no idea. I knew that I needed to cast it, so I did that.
Right.
Luckily, I landed some good actors, but an accident.
Yeah.
And I knew I had to schedule the first rehearsal, but I really didn't know what I was going to do in that rehearsal.
Right.
I mean, I read books and I talked to friends, and I think, but none of it really made sense. And this amazing moment that happened, Jared, when I went into that first rehearsal, it's like, there's this phrase in Aeschylus, necessity descends. And there was
Mm,
something about, there I was. We were playing, we were batting around ideas, bodies were moving in space. We were
mhm.
thinking through certain character issues. And all of a sudden, it was the most natural thing I had ever done. And I began to engage and make and began to understand what I wanted to do. And it wasn't as if I had never experienced something like that before, where I would walk into a place of uncertainty completely and began to discover within that space of uncertainty. But it was the event that marks my
Right.
recognition of what this might be.
Right. I love that you told that story because it actually leads perfectly into what the kind of second part of the question was. And as you were talking about that, it was reminding me of my first time teaching, which is it's the exact same situation of you directing this play where I
Yeah,
walked into the
teaching is like
classroom.
that, and frankly, being a college president is like that too
Yeah.
for me.
Oh,
So,
and we could talk about that, more in a second. But there was this sense where once I was in the room and all those students were there, suddenly I, kind of knew where I had to take this, and I didn't know what the class was going to become, but there was a sense that I knew kind of where it was going or what it was going to do, and I think that moment is interesting. And you talk about this in the book a couple times, and I just kind of want to hear you talk about it more and kind of pull at this thread a little bit of that kind of you know sense of kind of knowing what you had to do, you just kind of get into it and you start doing it, and that is different than, say, divine inspiration. That, it's not necessarily that, lightning bolt struck, you had this idea. You talk a lot in the book about, kind of education around having the pieces there, that are kind of a framework to begin to do this. It's a
Right.
very improv idea. And I'm wondering if you can talk about this difference between sort of amateurism, kind of going in without knowing anything, divine inspiration, versus knowing the tools or kind of studying the tools that kind of give you that place to go into those spaces of uncertainty. Do you know what I
Right.
mean there?
Yeah, I certainly do. I completely understand. So the interesting thing about uncertainty, and this is so relevant to our times, really. The interesting thing about uncertainty is it's a pretty frightening, anxious-filled place, right? I mean, it's
Right.
unsettling to be in uncertainty, and it requires a kind of courage to go in there. And so, what do we draw on to build that courage to go in there? The college student who directed the Boer went in there on sheer, like, on a hope and a prayer, really. And hopefully, in my later shows, I was able to build some skill base and experience and and sense of priority and focus that I wouldn't have had in my initial foray. Um, so that's how I like to think about it. I like to think about our background, our education, our experience, ethics, our values, even to a certain degree, talent, though that
Mm,
gets a little more complicated.
mhm.
That is all incredibly important and forms the scaffolding on which we stand as we reach into uncertainty. But it's not really, but reach into uncertainty we do nonetheless.
Right.
Um, and the point that you were also making regarding skill and improvisation, I think, is enormously important as well. That the paradox is, I think, that the greater the skill, the greater the freedom to explore, and
Mm,
that's what the great improvisers teach
mm,
us. They know their instruments cold. They know the music cold. Keith Jarrett could do what he did
mhm.
because of exquisite preparation. But then with that, he was able to go into a place of complete uncertainty. He concerted Cologne. He had no idea what he was going to do, and there's all sorts of incredible stories around that with the botched piano and the whole thing. And he went in
Right,
with
right.
one of the greatest concerts, live
Yeah.
concerts of all time. So that so you're right to cite that, but that's really how I see it. That we stand on that ground and that preparation. Diana Thader, who I just talked to, I just interviewed for my podcast too, and who
Mhm.
I interviewed for the book, and whose work is so exquisite. But she is, she her preparation, her skill, her experience is exactly what brings her to a point of readiness to
Mm,
be able to respond to that moment where
right.
she finds what she needs. Nothing that she could have ever set up, but she is prepared and ready, and then can go into an unknown world and make the discovery she needs to make.
You're kind of, tapping into something that I was thinking about as a educator reading the book. And you mentioned early on in this conversation that you wrote the book partly for your student, for the students. Um, and the last chapter in the book kind of moves beyond. I struggle with the language here. Move beyond what we kind of stereotypically define as creative,
Hmm.
artists, that sort of thing. And you talk about business, you talk about education, and kind of how these ideas apply there. And so there's this kind of sub message in the book that all of this type of work requires a certain type of creativity, whether you like self-define as an artist or not, which I think is true. And then on the flip side, I'm thinking about students who are, coming into school who maybe don't know that they have those skills already, or that they have something to stand on. And may be uncomfortable going into those spaces of uncertainties, like the people who self define as I am not a creative person or I am not an artist. And I'm wondering how you think about that, kind of in your position as president at Art Center, as an educator, how you think about channeling those skills, those values, that background, that kind of scaffolding that you're talking about, so somebody, I don't even know the word. Is it confidence? Is it, to go into those places, to kind of know that through doing this is how I learn what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, for me, the word is courage.
That's a good word.
Yeah. And I've said on more than one occasion, we tend to repeat some of these ideas sometimes, and
Yeah.
as college presidents and in other places too, um, that what we teach at Art Center is courage.
Mm,
And
mm,
so to define that a little bit more then is exactly along the lines of what you're asking. And that is the courage to make, the courage to go into uncertainty, the courage to be able to engage in a process that is, informed by the kind of skill, the thoughtfulness, the reading, the community,
mhm.
the world that one can draw on to give one courage to go into these places of the unknown and find, recognize, explore, surprise, however they may characterize it, um, and to move forward on that. So when I say I wrote it partially for my students. It really does come down to how many students I spoke to, and frankly, how many faculty I've spoken to as well, who talk about the fact that their students, when usually when they come to Art Center, don't most of them don't quite get that they don't have to have it all figured out
Ri
before they start.
Right, exactly.
And so we develop a curriculum in which we throw them in the deep end.
Mhm,
And the deep end learners really thrive at Art Center. We don't
mm.
talk about it. We don't read the books first. We give them some skill for sure. But okay, here's the project. Go in and let the work, let the making, let the mistakes, let the discoveries, let that inform the conversation. But afterwards, let that, the questions that are the product of the applied work, of the making, of the engaging.
Uh, it's that's really interesting, and it's also interesting to kind of think about in the context of your work and your kind of career trajectory. I mean, you mentioned your background in the theater earlier. You mentioned being, kind of tasked with directing that play, and that is very much kind of going in the deep end. From what I was able to kind of research and kind of figure out, it sounds like your move from kind of teaching into administration happened very quickly and was kind of thrown into the deep end.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
for sure.
and you've talked about how your, being a theater director is kind of the perfect training to be a college president. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that more and kind of use that maybe as an example to kind of talk about this like scaffolding and this kind of, skill in not having everything figured out, but having things figured out in this other thing to kind of
Right.
prep you for the
Right.
new thing. Can you
Exactly.
talk about that a little bit?
Exactly. Yeah. Well. First of all, for me personally, the work of directing a play and the work of being a college president draws on exactly the same kind of um, uh, personal sort of drive and experience and resources. And I will say till the day I die that being a theater director was the best preparation I could have possibly had to be a college president. And when you think about it, I mean, a director has an idea, goes into a rehearsal process, and that's a kind of that space of uncertainty, and begins to engage a community. And
Mhm,
that idea, which is an entry point, becomes developed and shaped by that community of actors and designers and a variety
mhm,
of different other people who are part of a community working on that. And then it gets changed and it gets improved, and there are discoveries along the way. And then the director's work is about handing that over increasingly to the cast, to the actor, where the most important
mhm.
moment happens between a spectator and a performer. and then nobody's thinking about the director. I mean, and nor should they be, right? And that's my experience as a college president, that, I have my ideas, I have my values, I have my thoughts about what education can be and should be, and ways in which we need to open ourselves. But there's this wonderful community I work with, and they wrestle with the idea, and they make the idea better, and they begin to own it themselves as much as possible, and it becomes a very collective notion. And
Mm,
then what's happened is you've empowered that moment, in the case of education, between a faculty member and a student, between a student and a student. I mean, it happens in different ways, but there's a moment that's empowered, and nobody's thinking about the college president, and nobody should. It's
right.
completely irrelevant, but something has been handed over. And that's the one way in which I see the work being very, very similar.
I mean, look, Lauren, I've obviously never been a college president, not even kind of close to being a college president, but I've often thought about administrative roles in higher education, which is, kind of my world, and thinking how being a graphic designer is kind of the perfect
Yeah,
setup, because it's thinking about organizing information, generating audiences, thinking about how you kind of communicate ideas in simple ways to get other people excited about them. And I wonder if there's something where kind of the skills become the lens through which you see the new thing, how that kind of shapes how you approach it.
absolutely
Uh,
right. Absolutely right. And there you go, just in the way you describe that. So there's this kind of, you can transfer these skills. And it gets back to the point you're making earlier about, kind of, creativity is not limited to a few geniuses around, but
right,
in fact,
right.
that we all kind of operate on it, and we can begin to think of our lives not as manifesting some preconceived vision. And how many people do we know who are stuck because of that?
Hmm.
But that life is a kind of making itself, and our
Hmm.
lives are making. And whether we're brilliant painters or writers, or whether we are involved in areas of life that have seemingly nothing to do with creativity, I think that process is going on. And then specifically, I mean, look what you have. If we can begin to conceive of our lives as, and our work as, braving places of not
Mm.
knowing, and remaining open as long as we can to discovery, I think we can experience a kind of pure joy of learning that
Mm.
can compel us to do all kinds of things, from teaching to administration to creating artifacts to creating a roundabout in a city in in the Netherlands that
Right,
allows people, that saves lives, as an example I
right,
use in the book, right?
right.
In Holland, sorry.
I'm very interested in administration, and I'm very interested in sort of two parts of administration. I'm interested in sort of the intersection between what we think of as administration and what we think of as creativity, and then also what we think of as administration and what we think of as scholarship. And you kind of operate at both of those intersections. And I'm curious how you think about your job as a college president, both as a creative endeavor and how these ideas of making to know that we're talking about are still a part of your work, but then also how you think about that, that idea of discovery and uncertainty mixed with the sort of like immediacy of things you have to do, balancing the budget, emails from students and faculty, all of that kind of stuff. How do you still, balance that with this, uh, creativity and uncertainty part of it, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Well, my immediate response to that, though I might want to go a little deeper in a minute, depending on how much courage I have. But
Yeah, go
um,
for it. I would love for you to go for it.
but the immediate response is that, the work of an administrator, the work of a college president anyway, does happen on different levels. And I think there is a very kind of practical day to day experience in which You just need to get certain kinds of things done.
Right.
And you're right. It's and there's a kind of operational necessity that you need to face. Um, uh, but on the sort of larger sense of direction and movement of an organization, its quote unquote vision, though it's not a word I love to use, as you know,
Mhm.
um, but a direction, a set of values, a set of driving questions, of issues, of aspirations. All of that really does, I think, for me, become a kind of making in
Mm.
community that begins to give shape to an organization.
Mhm.
So I think if you accept that kind of those different levels of
Yeah.
working that I think are there. The slightly deeper issue for me, or maybe not so slight, is that so much of what we learn, what we struggle with, the greatest books that we've written, the ideas and conversations that we've had, movies we've seen that mean so much to us, it opens a sense of the ambiguity of human experience in really interesting ways. And I see
Mm.
it that way. And,
Mm.
that Beckett's always calling for gray in his
Mm.
plays is no accident. I mean, the black and
Mm.
white, especially in today's discourse, is something that grates on me
Mm.
because I have learned and I have struggled always with these questions of that human experience is ambiguous. And it's when you hear a politician bang the table and say this is the way it is, that that's not just the way it is, no
Mm.
matter what side
Mm.
you may be on, or at least I
Mhm.
do. I mean, that's sort of how
Mhm. Mhm.
my own education, my thinking, and what I respect so much about the greatest books I've ever read. So
Mhm.
okay, so then we bring it back to your question about being an administrator or a college president. you, Being a leader that hovers in ambiguity is not the most effective way to go, right?
Right, right.
So that has been a very deep question for me: is how do I make choice
Right.
amidst ambiguity? And I'm not going to sit here and answer that question. I'm just going to tell you that that's been a struggle because I know I need to make that choice. But I don't forget about the fact that I know there are lots of different dimensions always operative, and it's been
Right.
one of the great challenges of my work as a leader, to be honest.
Let me. I think that's exactly right, and I'm going to ask you a very selfish question. That's like just kind of very practical because it's something that is on my mind right now. Because I think I'm very similar to you in that I'm comfortable with ambiguity. I like being in that. That's why I'm in the type of work that I'm in. But I'm also think that I'm fairly good at uh, organized administration, all of that kind of stuff I can do. Also, I can't do both of those things at the same time, though.
Mm.
One of them always suffers, and so I'm in the middle of advising season right now. So I'm just meeting with students all day long, helping them register for classes, and my research is not happening right now. This kind of other, like, I don't have that time for that deeper reflection. How do you kind of balance those? And I don't like the word balance, but I don't have a better word there. But how do you think about moving between both of those? The sort of the immediate, the organized, the certain versus the reflection, the deep thinking, the uncertainty.
It's a great. It's well. It's a beautiful question, really. I think, and let me know if this answers it. I think that, as the novelist Amy Bender says in the book, she sets aside 90 minutes a day, and
Right,
for her
right,
first novel, she tied herself to the chair, right?
right, right.
Or what Roseanne Somerson talks about, how she teaches her students they can't leave because
Yeah.
the classroom, because she says in this beautiful reflection, the body doesn't like being uncomfortable, and so it wants to move away. But if you set that rule that you can't leave, then you begin to go into these places of discomfort that can be wonderful and fertile
Mhm.
places of discovery. So with that, I guess that's the notion that comes to mind, that I do I do try to find those,
Mm.
because I could be swamped by the everyday details for sure, but I
Right.
do have to discipline myself to find those times for the writing, for the podcast, for that matter,
Mm-hmm.
and for great conversations, for the times I can spend with my colleagues at Art Center exploring bigger questions and ideas, metaphorically tying myself to a chair of something larger. Otherwise, I will be drowned by the everyday details, and there are so many, as you know.
Right. I mean, that's exactly why I asked you that question, is because you are, dealing with these in the midst of a pandemic where questions of education are
Mm-hmm.
completely changing. And somewhere in there, you also wrote this book and you're recording a podcast, which is very clearly deeply researched. And so you somehow figured out a way to do both of them.
Right, right. I tie myself to a chair,
Yeah,
basically. Yeah, I think
got
that's
it.
really true.
Got
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
I listened to an interview that you had done a while ago, and you were talking about your early education, and that the school that you went to had an emphasis on both kind of the overlap of practice and scholarship, which is something that has really run through all of your work. And I'm curious if you could kind of talk about how you think about that now, kind of both being a training as a theater director, working in the theater, but also writing about it, thinking about it, moving into education, and now running an art school. How do you think about both the making and the thinking? And this, in many ways, comes back to the early conversation about the book. Where does the kind of the thinking and the scholarship come in here?
The program and the part of my background that you're referring to really has to do with the PhD program in drama at Stanford. And what drew me to it was exactly that. And so this was going back to 1979. I'm revealing something about my age here, but I was very young. Um, and and what drew me to the program was that it was a PhD in theater, um, but it was simultaneously a professional
Right,
program
right.
in directing. And the fundamental of it, the basis of it, was that the if you wanted to be a great director, um, you needed to understand the world you were entering, the
Mm,
history of the theater. You needed to have an ability to understand and wrestle with dramatic literature. You needed to find inspiration and courage, frankly, in the history of a theater
right.
or the theory and the criticism behind it that could help drive you to the deepest kind of thinking and the deepest kind of work as a director. Um, and similarly, if you're going to be a great theater scholar or critic, you needed to understand how the theater worked. And so those two, the life in the rehearsal hall and the life in the seminar room, were mutually nourishing.
Mm,
And then, and that meant so much to me and did inform my career, so that I could, early in the early '90s, I wrote a book on Shakespeare films too,
right.
and that was also a way of trying to bring both the scholarly and the practice together in the most encouraging kind of way, or nurturing kind of way. I mean, and so imagine my delight when I left Berkeley, the faculty of Berkeley, to go to CCA, and
Mhm.
there was this entire institution, this group, like all
Right.
of our ACAD schools, really, and so much of what we do, which is fundamentally based on that kind of idea, that there
Right.
is the work that our students do in the studio, but we also want them to read books. We also want them to know the community that they are entering. We also want them to understand something about the work that others have done in this area, or how they talk about it, or the driving questions that are
Mhm.
involved, so that life of the mind and that life of the hand can work together in the most productive and beautiful ways. And so it was like I was home again when I got there. And of course, Art Center is has its own version of that I find incredibly inspiring.
I love that, and I think the way that you said that is so well said. That is the core of so much of my work, is this intersection
Mm,
between sort of practice and theory, or practice and scholarship. And that's, as we were talking about before we hit record, that was kind of the impetus for me to even go back to school, was because I couldn't figure out how to bring those together. I always tell my design students that, and actually this kind of goes back to Make to Know, now that I think about it, that every generation of graphic designers has to redefine what graphic design is for that
right,
generation. I mean, when
right,
I was in school, there were no apps, and now that's what most of my students are designing. And so having that theoretical framework can help, set the course of what that next kind of generation is. I think the way you talked about the theater hall and the seminar room are connected, is such a great, kind of metaphor there. I have just a couple quick questions, to wrap up. I'm curious what your relationship to the theater is now. Do you I mean, do you have time to kind of be involved in that work at all anymore?
well, as I say, I'm directing a very big play at
Right, right,
called ArtCenter.
right.
So that's what's happening. And the truth is, no, I haven't been. I certainly haven't been directing. I go to the theater. I read
Right,
about the
right.
theater. I have friends in the theater. I talk, but in a post Art Center life, I intend to explore that and probably go back. I miss it.
That was my next question, and we don't have to talk about this if you don't want to, but you did announce that you're retiring. Is it at
Yeah,
the end of
yeah,
this academic year?
it
So
is.
spring
So
2022? Okay.
it'll be end of June of 22. Right.
Okay. I was curious what's next. Kind of, what you obviously, you probably just want to relax a little bit, but what you're kind of thinking about next, what's top of mind, and what that kind of post art center, kind of career might look like, and if theater was a part of that. Have you thought about that much at
Yeah,
all?
theater is definitely a part of it, and I have all kinds of ideas about some projects I would love to do in the theater. I think I have another book in me,
Mm,
and it it I think it will touch on some of the ideas we talked about today,
mm.
regarding that Beckettian gray and
Yeah, yeah.
how we wrestle with ambiguity and how that's related to our creative lives too. I think there's some early thoughts about that, and there's a documentary I'd like to make as well.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if even some of these stories that I was able to explore and make to know, whether or not some of those stories might be part of that as well. So
That makes sense.
yeah, there's at this point it's at a very rudimentary stage. I don't know if it's gonna um, come
Right.
to life that way or not, but I have a lot of interest. So I feel, to be completely frank with you, I'm moving into a very different kind of creative phase of my life, and I'm excited about that. And so
Mm.
I think that's what I want to try to make space for.
That sounds very nice. I'm curious, however theater returns, especially thinking about this kind of practice and scholarship, how you would approach it differently. You don't have to answer that. It's not necessarily a question, but now with this kind of breadth of experience, how does that change how you, work in that space again?
Yeah,
Is kind of interesting to think
yeah,
about.
it is. It's a great question. Yeah.
My last question, and this is the question that I used to end all of these. I'm just interested to hear what you're reading right now.
Mm. Well, you may know. I don't know if you were able to get hold of this information, but you may know that the reason why Jessica Helfand's book on the face, one of the reasons why it was so meaningful to me, is that 21 years ago I woke up with a paralyzed face.
Right. I heard about this. Yes.
Yeah, and have had Bell's palsy, which was a kind of a 2-year ordeal, and then it turned into something called synkinesis, which means the nerves grow back in different ways, and
Mm.
when you smile, your eye closes, and when your eye closes, your
Oh.
neck juts out, and it's all
Oh,
kinds of
wow.
yeah. Anyway, the playwright Sarah Rule just published a book called Smile,
Mm.
and I don't know if you've read anything by her. She's a Tony Award-winning playwright.
Yeah.
She's so amazing and has just the most amazing writing style. Anyway, the book on Smile is because she 10 years ago, or no more than that now, she gave birth to twins and had postpartum Bell's palsy, and it lasted for a
Oh,
period of
wow.
10 years. Yeah. And
Wow.
it's her, I think the first sentence of the book, paraphrased here, is something like, I woke up one morning and my smile left my face, and took a walk or something like that.
Wow.
And so reading about that and the experience and the deep frustration of feeling something internally and not being able to express it through the face,
Mm-hmm.
is a kind of a tension and a problem that's very unusual, and speaks to me in a pretty deep way, and what that
Wow.
experience was. And she gives language to it that is very meaningful to me. So that's what I'm reading. And, to lighten it up a bit, she's hilarious about it too. She's an
Oh,
incredibly
great.
funny writer. And, there are passages in the book in which I was laughing out loud, just to have that
Yeah.
experience. Yeah. So that's what I'm reading right now.
That sounds great. I'm familiar with Sarah's work. I've not read any of it, but it sounds like I should do that. I might have to add that to the list.
It's a beautiful book. It's a beautiful book. I'm not totally done. But
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds
I think
fascinating.
I know how it ends, however.
Right. Well, your book, Make to Know, I loved, and I really enjoyed this conversation. I found it illuminating and also very, just kind of, like I said, very selfishly, very helpful for me and things I'm thinking about in my own work. So, Lorne, thank you for doing this. Thanks for taking the time. I really enjoyed this.
It was a delight. Thank you. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
This episode was recorded on October 13th, 2021. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can support the show on Patreon and find previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.